Welcome back to another philosophy video. In this video, I will discuss a new argument from evil that I have recently developed. A new problem of evil. And this argument I call the heaven ab initio creation, or HAIC. First of all, we have to understand that the problem of evil is a problem, is a theological problem. It's a problem that arises in theology because of a certain conception of God. God, in the God of theism, is considered to be a person. Obviously not a person like in flesh and blood person like you and me. But nonetheless, a person in the sense that God has a mind and he is endowed with freedom of the will. Also, according to theism, God is omnipotent, which means that God has immense power, infinite power, to do whatever he wants and to do whatever it's possible, obviously. All these divine attributes have been discussed over the centuries. In this video, I don't have time to explain them all, but very briefly, the idea of omnipotence is that God can do anything that is possible, logically possible, metaphysically possible, should be correct. Metaphysically possible meaning, for example, it is not possible to even conceive a round square. So it follows that not even God can create a round square. That would just be an absurdity. Also, God is omniscient, which means that God is infinitely wise. He knows everything. There is nothing that he does not know. He's omnibenevolent, which means that he's morally perfect and morally good, but not just good like a good person, but infinitely good. He is good in the sense that he is pure love. And I take it that this means that God cannot, by nature, be evil or do anything evil. Everything that he does or he thinks is good, is loving. And also God is eternal, which means that God is not a creature. God was not created at some point, did not come into existence, and will not go out of existence. It is an eternal being. Okay, so every time I say the word God from now on, I mean all these characteristics. There are more, of course. There might be more, but these are the important, the relevant attributes relevant to the present discussion. So God is a person, omnipotent, omniscient, etc. Now, another point is, what is evil? In theology, in philosophy, we talk about evil in the sense of evil and suffering. And more precisely, we talk about two sources of evil. One that could be called a natural evil, such as tsunamis, volcanoes, disease, anything that nature does, as a obviously not intentional, because nature has no is not an agent, a free agent. It's not a mind. But also there's what we call moral evil. And moral evil is everything that you can, all those terrible things that you hear in the news, serial killers, killing others, hurting others, but also bullying, abusing, saying things that are not kind to others, speaking or thinking ill of others. Anything that causes harm, psychological, physical, or even harm to nature. Okay, by the free acts of human beings, then that we call moral evil. If you can see that charming collage of some of the most evil people in the world, you just think about their acts, what they did, and you get an idea of moral evil. So now that I defined some terms, we know what God means and we know what evil means. What is the problem of evil? Evil and suffering constitute the greatest objection to the existence of God. Now, the problem of evil, I have to say that has been formulated in a few different ways, but there are two ideas of the problem of evil. One is the problem that is known as the logical problem of evil, and that is the idea that there's a logical problem, there's a logical inconsistency when you spell out the existence of God. When you outline an argument in the form of an argument, there's a logical problem that arises from the existence of God and the existence of evil in the world. But also there is what is called the evidential problem of evil, or I would say the evidential problem of evil is just the problem of evil, but outlined in a inductive way rather than a deductive way. But so I am going to talk about the strongest version of the problem of evil, which is the logical problem of evil. But it's in the end, the logical and the evidential are the two faces of the same metal. Okay, and it goes like this. So if God, and remember that we define God as an omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect being, if God exists, evil and suffering could not exist. This is the problem. So the problem is, why is there evil? Why do we suffer if God is real? Why is that? Because God would either prevent or destroy evil and suffering. And God knows how to do it because He's all-wise and omniscient and omnipotent, etc. So God has the power and the knowledge that to destroy or prevent evil. And so it follows that evil and God cannot possibly coexist. Okay? Now, in the logical version of this problem, the proponents of the problem of evil really mean that just the idea of God and the idea of evil are just completely opposite. They cannot be together. It's like saying, for example, light and darkness. Okay, if you turn on the light in your room, there's no darkness, and if there's darkness, there's no light. Or, for example, dry and wet. If your t-shirt is dry, then it means that it is not wet. But if it is wet, it cannot be dry. Or, for example, up and down. Okay, so if something is up there, it cannot be down, right? And vice versa. So this is the way that some people see the problem of evil. They're just opposites. God and evil cannot exist in the same place, in the same world. So the question is, can God and evil coexist? Are there ways to explain how God and evil exist, coexist? How do we answer this? Over the centuries, different philosophers have formulated very interesting responses to the problem of evil. I am going to discuss two specific ones because I think that they are the most important ones, and I think that they cover all possibilities. The first one is that human beings do evil, moral evil. So why do they do that? Because they have free will. Free will means free evil. God cannot destroy or prevent evil because in order to do so, the argument goes, God would have to determine people to be good. But then what's the point of determining people to be good? Then people would be good just because they are determined to do so, which seems to be some kind of marionettes, some puppets, God's divine puppets. That's not good. So freedom is important because freedom is what allows people to reflect, to think, to act in ways that are meaningful to them and to the universe. Unfortunately, that very freedom, which is very important, is the very reason why some people use that freedom to do evil. But so the theist has a justification that seems plausible. The theist would say something like, let me give you an analogy. Suppose that I have a car and you don't have a car. You need to go to work and you need to borrow my car. Now, if you use that car to go to work and then go home and then give it back to me, it's all fine and good. But if you instead, while you're driving, you decide to run over some pedestrians and kill them, then it would be wrong to blame it on me and say, well, you gave me the car. And similarly, with regard to freedom, theists might say you cannot blame God for giving you freedom because God gave you freedom to be good, to do good things, not bad things. So it's totally up to you what you do. If you don't like it, then God would have to take away that freedom. But and even limiting freedom, some people have suggested, what if God limits freedom? Well, as long as you have freedom, some kind of freedom, any degree of freedom, you can still freely do things that are bad. So this is one response, and it seems plausible to me. The second response is that evil is useful. So in a sense, it seems that according to this view, God intentionally allows freedom because freedom is an instrument. Freedom is an instrument that enables human beings to develop virtue. Because think about it, when you suffer, you learn some lessons. When when something happens, someone dies, war, famine, all these problems teach us, as bad as they are, but they teach us certain lessons. Okay, so for example, let's say that you are unaware of the fact that people suffer in the world. Now, if something bad happens to you, then you learn something. You learn a virtue. You learn compassion, and so that was useful. Okay. You have to look at the big picture. So certain things that are bad happen all the time. People die, car accidents, and death and disease and so on and so forth. But those things are lessons. And when you look at the big picture, these lessons, these moral lessons, will help us choose to be good and exercise our freedom in such a way that we always do good. Okay. So these two answers, these two defenses, address the problem of evil fairly well, I think, in my view. But they do not address my heaven ab initio creation. Let me explain why. Now, before I outline the argument, I would like to take a moment to explain that my argument relies on these three main assumptions. The first one is that God creates free creatures to freely love God. I don't think that this is a controversial statement, because when you think about most theistic religions, say Christianity as an example, and if you read the Bible, you ask any theologian or a priest or a pastor or any religious person, why did God create human beings? And I think that in Christianity, as in other religions, the answer is crystal clear. God created us because He wants us to know God. And He wants us to love God, to come to God. That's a very straightforward answer. So I think that this is not controversial at all. God creates us, so His goal is to have creatures that freely acknowledge God and love God. The second one is also not very controversial at all. And that is that God can, if He wants to, can create free creatures directly in heaven. That's all this number two is saying. It's not saying anything else. It's just saying that God, if He wanted to, without looking at the consequences, just don't focus on the consequences, but focus on what it says. That God can say, I will create free creatures directly in heaven. Okay? So, in other words, if God wants to do it, there's no reason whatsoever why God would create a physical world like our world, like our universe, and heaven. God can create heaven in the first place directly without a physical world. This might be controversial a little bit for some people, but I encourage you to reflect on why I think this is very plausible. There's no reason, it seems to me, that God cannot do that. Okay? If God is omnipotent and omniscient, he can do it. He can create free-willed creatures and directly in heaven. Number 3 is a little more complicated, but still I think it's very plausible. If God could avoid evil and enable soul building, because these are the two important things, it seems to me that he would create directly in heaven, because there would be no other reason why a physical world is necessary. And the idea here is that if you look at God as a father, use that analogy of a father. Suppose that you are the father of a child. Before the child is born, if you could push a button or do something to the effect that your child will be happy for his or her entire life and never get in trouble, have a wonderful life, I think that intuitively it's something that any rational and good parent would. Now, if, for example, it's not necessary to have a physical world and a physical existence, why create physical existence unless there's a reason? And it seems to me that the only reasons are preserving free will, given point 1. You see, because the point 1 is the goal. What is the goal that God is trying to achieve? Well, create free creatures that love God, that know and love God. And so it seems to me that as long as God can create a situation, a world where free-willed creatures exist, and they are able, so it's possible for these creatures to acquire virtue, and in this world evil does not exist whatsoever. I don't see why God would want to do otherwise. This is why I think that these 3 assumptions are plausible and they are true. Now, given these assumptions, the argument, HAIC argument, works this way. From these premises, P1, if God can create free beings directly in heaven, avoiding evil and enabling soul building, then God creates free beings directly in heaven. And P2, God can create free beings directly in heaven, avoiding evil and enabling soul building. It follows P3, that God creates free beings directly in heaven. Now, the problem is that God did not create free creatures in heaven. And so from this, it follows that God is either not omnipotent, not omniscient, or not perfectly good. And therefore, it follows that if God is either not omnipotent, not omniscient, or not perfectly good, God does not exist. Although it is possible that a God, some other God, exists, a God that is not that has different attributes, not the attributes the divine theistic attributes. Now, clearly the main contention is premise 2, namely that God can create free beings directly in heaven, avoiding evil and enabling soul building. When you look at P2, it has 2 parts. One is that God can create free beings directly in heaven, and the second part is that God can avoid evil and enable soul building. I don't believe that theists will contest the first part, because as I have already remarked, God can, by definition, create free beings directly in heaven if he so chooses. There's no logical inconsistency there. It's not like creating a square circle. So I think that they will contest the second part, that God can do that and still avoid evil and enable soul building. So let me address each one. Avoid evil and enable soul building. Let me start with 1. Why do I think that God can do that and still avoid evil in heaven? It is important to understand that moral evil is caused by lust. It's caused by lust in the sense that when you think about evil, moral evil in the world, think about evil people and what they do. Why do they do what they do? Well, either they are mentally unstable, to put it mildly. Maybe they are deranged. Maybe there's something biologically wrong with them. And so they don't know what they're doing. So in a sense, we wouldn't say that they are free. But think about just a regular person. Well, what is a regular person? Think about a person, a functional person who has no biological problems or neurological problems. Person who's free to do what he or she wants. Why does this person do evil? Choose to do evil? Typically, it is due to lustful behavior, passion, money, power, and other things that, when you think about it, other factors due to lack of perfection or lack of money, lack of power. So there's a desire. People who are evil desire to do evil because they desire to achieve something. They want to have money, they want to have more sex, they want to have more power, etc. Okay. Also, of course, we have to contemplate the possibility that some people do evil out of ignorance. For example, I don't know that doing X will cause the death of suffering of others. Now, what I claim is that my argument avoids both kinds of problems, and furthermore, it avoids natural evil. Let me explain. So if God creates ab initio in heaven, ab initio means in the first place. First of all, God can easily monitor the ignorance, as his creatures are spirits. They are non-material beings. So it is very easy for God to monitor his creatures' development. It's not like human beings on earth, where God might be present, but is not present in every moment, every second. God doesn't speak to you in your ears and tell you what to do for this problem or the other problem. So you are there in the presence of God, and God can guide his creatures and avoid the ignorance and teach them. Second of all, in heaven, we have to understand that there are no wallets to steal. There are no banks to rob, no people to murder or hurt, and no material objects. So, actually, moreover, you have to remember that in heaven, heaven is a state of eternal bliss. So these creatures are created directly in a state of complete bliss and eternal bliss in the presence of God. So the point is that the conditions for lusting, the conditions for doing evil are absent. God's creatures cannot steal because there's nothing to steal. There's no personal property in heaven. They cannot kill because, for obvious reasons, they're already spirits. You cannot kill a spirit. They cannot abuse others. How could they possibly abuse others or harm them in any way? Moreover, as I said, God's creatures exist in eternal bliss. And so they already have everything that they want. Evil people do evil because they need to do it because they want to be happy. It makes them happy. It satisfies them. But creatures that are created directly in a state where they are already in a state of complete joy and bliss, then there's nothing left for them. It's not that they need something else. They already have maximum bliss. What else could they possibly desire? So they don't have the opportunity, nor do they have the desire to lust or do evil. Unless they are ignorant and they don't know that thinking in a certain way, contemplating God in a certain way is wrong, which as I explained, is something that God can correct. Also, we have to understand that freedom is the rational capacity to choose what to do or not to do. So freedom does not depend on the opportunities that I have, but rather to my decision about things that I want to do and acts that I want to perform or not. So the lack of certain opportunities does not abrogate freedom. Furthermore, the most important point that we have to remind ourselves is that God cannot sin by nature. And yet, God is a free being. So there's no contradiction in thinking that free creatures can exist without evil. The problem is that if they are on earth, on a physical spectrum, in a physical realm, then they are bound to do evil because they have physical stuff, because they have a body. They are embodied beings. They are material stuff. As long as there's material stuff and creatures are physical, then they will suffer. So the idea here is that by removing the source of suffering, which is the physical body and physical objects, you remove completely evil and suffering. Let me give you an illustration of what I mean. Imagine that there are two realms, and in these two realms there are two different situations that we can imagine as by using the analogy of fish. So on the left side there's a fish in a fish bowl. On the right there's a fish in the ocean. Now suppose that the fish in the bowl says to herself, "Oh, today is a very lovely day. I am happy." Okay, this is perfectly possible. Now, if this little fish is born and raised in the fish bowl and unaware of the ocean, obviously the fish is not going to suffer. It's not going to say that she wishes to have been born in the ocean. Now, clearly, from our perspective, we can say that the fish in the ocean has more freedom in the sense that it has more opportunities. But when you think about each fish's individual freedom, each fish has the appropriate freedom. The freedom that is appropriate to the kind of environment where the fish exists. And it would be wrong to say that the fish in the ocean has more freedom than the fish in the fish bowl. Now, the only way that you can say that is to take the fish that was born in the ocean and remove it from the ocean and place the fish inside the fish bowl. So only in that case, then the fish could say, "I had more freedom in the ocean, and now I have less freedom." But if the fish is born directly in the bowl, there's no reason to believe that the fish would say, "I could have more freedom." So the bottom line is that each fish has the appropriate freedom. Each fish can be happy. Each fish can be virtuous, because each fish can learn certain virtues. The fish in a bowl would develop certain virtues that are appropriate to a fish that lives in a bowl, and the fish in the ocean can learn appropriate virtues that are useful for a life in the ocean. Now, the best part of this is that in the fish bowl, there are no opportunities for the fish to sin, and therefore there's no sin. Now, think about it this way. Suppose that the fish in the ocean taunts smaller fishes. So it's a naughty fish, and he bothers other fish. Freely, of course. But suppose that the fish in the bowl lives there and there are no other fish around. Then that opportunity is removed. Now, the fish still has freedom, but there's no opportunity to bother other fish. And so, with this analogy, what I want to say is that that human beings on earth have many opportunities to sin. Again, going back to the previous point, because we have physical bodies, we have needs, we have necessities, and some of us do exercise our freedoms in ways that cause harm and cause suffering and evil to others. And this would be the fish in the ocean. Okay. Now, what I suggest in my argument is the fish in the bowl in the first place. If God creates his creatures directly in heaven, where there are no opportunities to murder, to do all the evil things that human beings do on earth, then God's creatures can be free. They can develop moral virtues. They can be happy and still be free, and evil doesn't exist. Now, suppose that, just for the sake of argument, somehow God's creatures in heaven do something that is bad. Still, the situation is more convenient in this sense because it would be easier for God to correct the situation. On earth, God does not correct the situation. For example, the terrorist attack perpetrated on 9/11, surely God could have diverted the airplane or any other miracle, but he didn't do it. So the point is, human beings freely do things that they're evil, and there's no God. In many cases, there's no God diverting things or changing things, because God allows human beings to undertake certain actions. But in heaven, God's creatures will be monitored by God because they will be in the presence of God. They would know what God wants. They wouldn't imagine, for example, that there are, 12, 13, 50 virgins awaiting on the other side, and or other strange ideas. They would know because God is there in their. They are in the presence of God. Okay, let's move on to point 2. So point 1 is that evil does not exist in heaven if God creates his creatures directly in heaven. The second point is it possible to enable God's creatures to build good moral characters? I think so. These creatures that I call heaveners can develop virtues that are appropriate to the kind of creatures that they are and the kind of environment in which they exist. Now think about it. According to theism, the reason why evil exists is because we need to learn, as I said earlier, we need to learn virtue. So, for example, through suffering, we acquire virtue. For example, we learn compassion. Poverty, suffering can teach us compassion. But the problem is, why do we need compassion when we go to heaven, which is a state of eternal bliss where poverty and suffering doesn't exist? So, in other words, the theistic picture that says that we suffer because we need to learn virtues, that then they are essential for our moral characters once in heaven. They're really useless, because why do we need to be compassionate in a world where there's no need to be compassionate because no one suffers? And the third point is that God can just give his children eternal bliss and perfect their characters in heaven. There's no reason to believe that we cannot deserve eternal bliss. There's no reason to believe that God has to make us work in order to deserve eternal bliss. Again, I would like to go back to my analogy of the father. If you are a father or a mother, let's say mother is even better. If a mom is pregnant, a woman is pregnant, and can decide the fate of her child. So if she could do something to the effect that her child will be happy for the rest of her life, why wouldn't she do it? Now, if you can create a child and the challenges of life, competition, and suffering are not required, imagine that would be a beautiful life. Then why would you still expose your children to suffering and adversities if they are not needed? You would just grant eternal bliss to your children. So there's no reason to believe that there's any benefit in a life, a terrestrial life, a physical life. Unless there are some reasons, but the theists would have to explain some reasons why life as a physical being on earth is very beautiful, and we would miss out a lot. But it doesn't seem that way, because typically theists argue that this life on earth is imperfect, is not good, and the real blessing is once we are in the presence of God, and we're going to forget all the problems, all the evil, all the suffering in the world, because heaven is so beautiful. Well, then God should do it in the first place. Now, let me consider a couple of objections that are very pertinent here. These objections are advanced to me, to my argument, all the time. The first objection is that it is not true that if God creates directly in heaven free creatures, these creatures do not do evil. And the evidence, the proof, is Lucifer, who was an angel. Okay, Lucifer was not a human being, was created directly in heaven by God. Yes, but you have to remember that in this picture where Lucifer exists, there is a heaven, but there's also earth. And you have to remember that human beings are God's favorite beings. So God loves, that's what the story, as far as I understand it, that God loves human beings more than his angels. Furthermore, Lucifer, just like other angels, are special creatures. They are endowed with special powers. Okay? And so it is true that according to the story, if you read the Bible, for example, there is war in heaven. But that war, okay, those problems, those issues are caused by angels. There are zero stories of human souls in heaven causing evil in heaven. It is just the angels. So the simple answer is that God, in the argument that I present, God would not create angels. God would not create creatures that have special powers. God would create free will creatures. They're all the same. There are no difference in race or powers or anything else. And he would love them all equally. The second objection is, okay, let's just think about it for the sake of argument. What if these creatures somehow, that I can't think how, somehow they are naughty, they are bad, they do something bad? Then what? What is God going to do at that point? Well, in the first place, what could these creatures possibly do in heaven that is bad? could they go on strike? Could they say, just fold their hands, their arms in protest and say, "No, God, I'm not going to comply with your policy"? Well, that seems silly. I mean, what would they do anyway? Where would they go? There's no other world, but they have to face God, and they exist in a state of eternal bliss. What could they go? What else could they desire? So it seems to me that if the theist wants to refute my argument, the theist has to come up with some concrete examples as to how creatures that are created directly in a state of eternal bliss, number one, how they could cause evil, and number two, why would they cause evil? Because there are no reasons to cause evil. After all, these creatures have everything that you can possibly desire. They have eternal bliss in the presence of God, and there are no wallets. There are no physical bodies, Ferraris, villas, Armani suits. There's nothing there that that could generate lust and therefore generate evil. In the second place, even if somehow these beings could, I don't think they could, but even if they could do something evil, it seems to me very easy that God can create only the subset of free creatures that would freely obey him if created directly in heaven. Okay? Since God knows the future of every being, well, that's a controversial idea. Some people might say, well, God doesn't know that. Okay, that's a valid point then. But it seems to me that many theists would say that God knows who will sin. And so he could create a subset of beings that do not sin. Now, third point is that even so, then what's the problem? God can discipline them. He can take them and teach them, rehabilitate them, and teach them not to sin, not to do evil. Now, this of course is a very extreme case, but God can even contemplate the idea of destroying them. But in this process, these beings can learn how to be good. So there's a possibility, plenty of possibility, opportunities to become morally, maybe not morally perfect like God, but moving in that direction. And the fourth and final point is that when we think about the problem of evil, what is the problem of evil? The problem of evil is the problem of there's too much evil in the world. There's tremendous, horrendous evil in the world. There's suffering in the world. So my argument says there is a way that is better for God. God doesn't have to create human beings and the physical world and all the horrible evil and the horrendous evil that exists in the physical world. By creating by creating free will creatures directly in heaven. So all that stuff is not gonna happen. So it is better. It's still better than this world, even if some of God's creatures would be somehow would do something that is not proper. It's still better in terms of evil to create that kind of world than the physical world first, with the possibility of heaven and hell. So in conclusion, according to theism, it is crystal clear why God created us. God created us to know him and love him. Given such a goal, God ought to create ab initio in heaven. So, heaven ab initio creation avoids natural evil and it avoids moral evil, as I explained. Natural evil because there are no hurricanes and earthquakes and volcano eruptions in heaven. Plus, there's no moral evil because there are no instances of rape, murder, and theft, and so on. No war. And it would avoid atheism, by the way, because you know that God exists. You cannot be an atheist in heaven. You are already in the presence of God. Also, the heaven ab initio creatures are free and acquire appropriate virtues. They can do this. They can contemplate God, and in their contemplation of God, they can spend an eternity perfecting their views, their understanding of God. But because this is not the case, then it follows that God does not exist. The God with a capital G. Maybe there is a God with a lowercase g, as I have argued in my book, Deism. But that's a different story for a different day. Thank you. I hope you enjoy this lecture. Feel free to contact me. Feel free to ask me questions. I'll be glad to answer all the questions. And I'll see you in the next philosophy video.